Rebbe soll gesund sein, began to Farbrengen this afternoon that yesterday was Zayin Elul. Sorry, Zayin Cheshvan, excuse me. Zayin Ma Cheshvan was yesterday, and today, being that the Shabbos elevates all the days of the past week, especially the day which comes right close to Shabbos, which in this case was Friday, the day of Zayin Cheshvan. So this day is elevated on today, the Yom HaShabbos. What is the inyan of Zayin Cheshvan? So we know the Rebbe stressed many times, and today as well, that Zayin Cheshvan is the day that when the last one of the Oilei Regolim would arrive home, this would be on Zayin Cheshvan, 7 days in the month of Cheshvan. In other words, Yidden had to be Oilei Regel, come to Yerushalayim, come to the Beis HaMikdash on Sukkot. So in those days, for the one that lived the furthest point away from the Beis HaMikdash, he would get home on Zayin Cheshvan. So that is why, Al Pi Halacha and Eretz Yisrael on Zayin Cheshvan, that is when they begin saying, asking for rain in Baruch Aleinu. So Bichlal, this comes as another point in the inyan of the Yankev Halach Ladalkoi. We know that after Simchas Torah begins the Tnuah, the inyan of the Yankev Halach Ladalkoi, during the month of Tishrei, that is when we get strength for the entire year. And when do we get home and begin getting involved in the Avodah, the day-to-day Avodah? This begins after Tishrei. So in the Remes, the Rebbe says that the Rebbe Marash writes that the V'yankev Halach Ladalkoi really begins Mitzoy Simchas Torah, Mitzoy Yom Kippurim. We are used to the inyan of V'yankev Halach Ladalkoi as of Mitzoy Simchas Torah. Really it begins as of Mitzoy Yom Kippur. Why? Because after we pass, so that is in the first stage. In the first stage, after we pass the Avodah of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, that is when we come already into an inyan of V'yankev Halach Ladalkoi. And as the Rebbe explained today, the inyan of Yankev in Yisrael is also reflected in the two main concepts of Torah and Mitzvahs. Torah is the inyan of Yisrael, Li Roish, that's the inyan of Limud HaTorah. However, Mitzvahs is reflected in the shame of Yankev. After we go through Sukkot, and we come to Mitzvah Simchas Torah, here we have gone through already an additional stage, and here we are getting closer, another step closer to get involved into the Avodah of the day-to-day Avodah of the entire year. However, we know that the Minig Yisrael is that during the days of Tishrei that come after Simchas Torah, we still do not recite any Tachnon on those days. So this in itself shows us that those days, though on one hand they are Vachadika days, but these are these Vachadika days that have still some sort of a very close Shaychus to Yontif. So that is why after we have gone through the entire month of Tishrei, and we are entering into Cheshvan, this is when the V'yankev Halach Ladalkoi begins on a yet further stage. In Cheshvan itself, we also have these days, the days of Cheshvan until we reach 7 days in Cheshvan, which was yesterday, and now the final stage of V'yankev Halach Ladalkoi really begins, that we have passed by all the inyanim of Tishrei and all the great things which the Yom Tovim throughout the month of Tishrei given to us, and now we have to unpack this throughout the entire year. And here the Rebbe quoted a Zohar, that the Zohar tells us that the days from the beginning of Elul till Vav Cheshvan, this is how the Zohar puts it, are days of specialty, special days. Obviously, why he mentions Elul, the Rebbe says, this is explained very simple. Because the entire month of Elul, the Alter Rebbe teaches us, is a month of Melech Basada. That's a month when we have easily access to the Rabbeinu Shalom, like a king who leaves his palace and comes into a field and is available to everyone. Then we come through the entire month of Tishrei. After Tishrei, we still have additional days in Cheshvan, and as the Zohar puts it, until Vav Cheshvan, that from the beginning of Elul till Vav Cheshvan, these are very special days. So now we are really, that we have passed already Zayin Cheshvan, and this is the Shabbos that elevates Zayin Cheshvan. Now we really have to get involved into the Avodah V'yankev Halach Ladalkoi. As the Rebbe stressed, we find by Yaakov, we find the expression Vayisa Yaakov Raglov, that Yaakov really began walking Vayisa Yaakov Raglov, he began walking very, very strong. He walked moved fast. So keeping in mind the Indian of Vayisa Yaakov Raglov, and when Yaakov raises his legs and really begins walking strong, this is when he gets a special bracha from the Rabbeinu Shalom. So now here again, we have an opportunity to do the Vayisa Yaakov Raglov and get involved into the V'Yakov Halach L'Darkei, unpacking whatever we have gained through the entire month of Tishrei and putting it to use throughout the entire year. Something additional is this year, that this day that elevates Zayin Cheshvan, which is the conclusion of the entire month of Tishrei, falls out when? On Shabbos Parshas Lech Lecha. Here the Rebbe says to find a shayches between the idea of Lech Lecha and the idea of a Yankev Halach L'Darkei, this is something which is extremely obvious. So obvious to an extent that even a Pashat Shebepshutim, the most simple Jew, even a child, that realizes right away the relation between the idea of Lech Lecha and the idea of a Yaakov Halach L'Darkei. So again, being that today it is Parshas Lech Lecha, so it's giving us again extra strength for a Yid to get koiches to fulfill this inyan of a Yaakov Halach L'Darkei, getting involved with the Aveda of the day-to-day Aveda which we're involved in throughout the entire year, and to bring the inyanim of Tishrei, which is inyanim of Getlichkeit, and the inyanim of Yontif, which all we have accumulated throughout the month of Tishrei, to put this into action throughout the entire year. And as it's explained in Chassidus, the inyan of Lech Lecha, Ma'artzecha me'melaretecha, u'mebeis avicha. Chassidus teaches the inyan of Artzecha me'melaretecha, meaning that a person has to get out of his inyanim which his artzi is. In other words, the inyanim which he got himself used to, his habits, his customs, whatever he's got himself arranged his life. This is what we are told, Lech Lecha, to go out of our own selves, to strive to fulfill the will and the wish which the Rabbeinu Shalom is instructing us to do. While talking about this inyan of Lech Lecha, and the Rebbe is stressing that even the shayches between Lech Lecha and the Yankev Halach L'Darkei is so obvious that even a Pashat Shebepshutim, the most simple person, can see it because it's right away spelled out in the word Lech Lecha. Rebbe got into an inyan where he says the Pashat Shebepshutim, Taki realizes this. However, when we are talking about those who go into the category of Rosheichem Shiftechem, your leaders, for them it is hard to realize many inyanim. And the Rebbe spoke about a few particular inyanim. First, the Rebbe spoke about, when the Rebbe speaks without mentioning names, and it's not always obvious to what exactly he refers to, but those that have to definitely get the message. Rebbe was referring to an inyan, to somebody who has begun explaining the inyanim in Chassidus, and is successful in it. And it is something which, when it reaches to other people, they gain a lot of knowledge in Chassidus through his interpretations and explanations. However, this person has stopped in the middle and has not completed his work of explanation of inyanim in Chassidus. True, the Rebbe says, he is involved in many other good inyanim. He's not saying that he's wasting his time. He's definitely doing other inyanim. No, not at all. He's definitely involved in other good inyanim. However, this is an important inyan, and especially the Rebbe says, when an inyan has to be completed, as long as it is not completed, it is definitely not considered shleimus. Shleimus, a completion of something. Even those parts, those chalokim that he has done, as long as he has not completed all the volumes, or all the inyanim which he has to put together, even those that are already published, the Rebbe says it's still not a complete thing. So the Rebbe says, we find by Adam HaRishon. Adam HaRishon was a Yitzir Kapav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He was created by the Rebbeinu Shalom. And normally we know there's an inyan of Akdim Etanise. Svarim say that the Yetzer Hara usually gets into a person before the Yetzer Tov. So later people have a teretz, well, the Yetzer Hara came to me before the Yetzer Tov, that's why I'm listening to him. However, by Adam HaRishon it was not so. And we're talking about a person who was created, mamish by the Rebbeinu Shalom, Yitzir Kapav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Chazal tells us. Still, it came the very first day of his creation. HaKadosh Baruch Hu told him he should wait another few hours. Chazal tell us it was a question of waiting 3 more hours. If had he wait 3 more hours, then it would be permissible for him to eat from the Eitz Hadas. And Adam HaRishon could not hold himself back. So we see, the Rebbe says, that at times it's hard for people to really fulfill what they are supposed to. And we can take an example from Adam HaRishon. The Rebbe says he would very much not want to start up with Adam HaRishon. It's very, very inconvenient to vercheppen sich, use the Yiddish expression, with Adam HaRishon, especially that we are all descendants of Adam HaRishon. B'nai Yisrael as well as B'nai Noach. Everybody is a descendant of Adam HaRishon. But still, being that these inyanim are related to us in Torah, so we find in Torah as the inyanim are. And we find by such a person like Adam HaRishon, he couldn't have held himself back for 3 hours so that he should be able to eat from the Eitz Hadas a little bit later, and then it would be permissible fully by the Rabbeinu Shalom that he should eat from it. And he didn't. And we see the consequences that it led to. Mele, the Rebbe again said, he is referring to this inyan in particular, which he's talking about. However, there is a lesson to it which can derive, which has a shaykhus to each and every one of us. Every one of us can definitely accomplish much more than he is accomplishing. And this is what he's referring to. Why is it that we neglect ourselves, and if we were told to accomplish these inyanim, we definitely were given koiches to fulfill these inyanim, and when a yid has koiches to fulfill certain inyanim, and he neglects these koiches, and he doesn't fulfill it, the Rebbe says it's really a shame. And then the Rebbe spoke about another inyan, and that is the inyan of the shchuna, about the stabilization of Crown Heights, about the neighborhood. The Rebbe spoke about it also, extremely painful. The Rebbe says that we look at other neighborhoods outside of Crown Heights, they flourish extremely well, and they grow, and they expand, and they are very successful. However, here in Crown Heights, with the context that could be made, and the context and the relations that were already established, the Rebbe used the expression, it's lemata mitam vadas. Usually we know there's an expression, lamaila mitam vadas, it's higher than understanding. The Rebbe says it's below our understanding to look at the achievements which were accomplished for the success of the neighborhood of this shchuna. And again, like I just mentioned, the Rebbe spoke about it, very extremely painful. And then later came back again to the inyan of the Yankov Halach Ledalkai, that all the inyanim should be corrected, especially we're talking about it in the Pashas Lech Lecha, which also reflects the idea of Lech Lecha, the inyan of Halicha, constantly going from Madrega to Madrega. And this is the inyan of which we are told at the end of Tishrei, when we go out into the world for the future year to come, that we have to take along with us this inyan of Yaakov Halach Ledalkai. Later in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe referred to what he has written in the letter of Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan, as well as discussed in last week's Farbrengen, whereby the Rebbe suggested the importance of making kinusim, of making gatherings for men, gatherings for women, as well as gatherings for children, throughout this past week, which is an appropriate week between Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan and Zayin Cheshvan, 7 days in the month of Cheshvan, which the Rebbe explained last week, the great importance of these inyanim. Today the Rebbe added on, for those that did not have an opportunity to fulfill it throughout the first week of Cheshvan, like by many inyanim in Torah, we find an opportunity for hashlameh. The same applies to this inyan as well, and an extension could be made that until Tesvav Cheshvan, until 15 days in the month of Cheshvan, for those that didn't have a chance to arrange kinusim, gatherings, there's still an appropriate time for it until 15 days in the month of Cheshvan. And here the Rebbe referred to a pasuk. There's a pasuk in Tanakh, Bizakecha yatzilcha kibutzecha. Rebbe says the pasuk is talking about negative inyanim. However, what we do derive from this inyan is, what we do derive from this pasuk is Bizakecha, when you will scream, Yatzilcha kibutzecha, you will be saved through your gatherings. So what do we see from this? That the inyan of the kinus is something which can have a tremendous impact. It can bring to hatzal, it can bring to rescue, it brings help spiritual help. As well, this koyach which is hidden in the inyan of kinusim. In other words, this inyan of kinusim has a special koyach within it, that when Yidden gather, v'osu kulam aguda echos, Yidden gather in the format of an aguda, they congregate to discuss in Yonim, bring down the Yonim and Amaisa Huaika, bringing down the Yonim, leading to action in all the Yonim of strengthening and spreading Yiddishkeit. This brings to an inyan of Yatzilcha. As usual in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe also referred to Arashi in this week's Sedre, as well as the comments of his father, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, on the Zoyar in Parshas Lech Lecha. First, we will go to the Rashi in this week's Sedre. In Parshas Lech Lecha, right. Thank you. Yud Zayin Hey. It's before Shvi, the end of Shishi. We find that the Rabbeinu Shalom is addressing himself to Avraham Avinu. And he's telling him, "V'lo yikari oit es shimcha Avram." You shall no longer be called Avram. V'hoya shimcha Avraham. Your name from here and after shall be Avraham. And he explains, ki, as the Rebbe Taich, ki here is a reason. What is the reason that your name shall no longer be Avram but Avraham? Av hamoin goyim nesaticha. The Rebbe is telling Avraham Avinu, I've made you a father for hamoin goyim, huge nations. If we look into Rashi, Rashi quotes the words, Ki av hamoin goyim. And again, it's important for Rashi to quote the word Ki as well, because Ki is the reason of why the Rebbe is changing Avraham Avinu's name. So Rashi explains, Loshen Nutrikin Shel Shmoi. It's an abbreviation of his new name. His new name is Avraham. Avraham brings out the idea of Av hamoin goyim. In the format of the Rosh Tevis, for the abbreviation. Now here Rashi gets involved. Initially his name was only Avram. Initially, Avram Avinu was only an Av in Aram, which is where he resided. So that is why his name initially was Avram, an Av in Aram. Va'achshav, however now, Avram Avinu became Av l'kol ha'olam, and not for the entire world. So that is why it is no longer befitting for him to carry a name, father of Aram, because he's no longer a father of Aram. The Rebbe has given him much more. The Rebbe is giving him Av hamoin goyim nesaticha. Va'afilu reish shehoisa bei mitchila, even the reish which he had, lo yizoza mimkoima, did not move from its spot. In other words, the Rebbe could have named him Avraham without the reish. The Av hamoin goyim, there's no need for the reish to be here. Av hamoin is Avham without a reish. The reish, the Rebbeinu Shalom didn't move. Why didn't the Rebbeinu Shalom move the reish? Sharashi explains, Sha'af yud shel Sarai, even when the Rebbe changed Sarai's name from Sarah to Sarai, the yud had tainus. Nisramo al Ashchin had tainus on the Rebbeinu Shalom. Why did you take my name away from its tzedekis? Yeshua, until around 1,000 years later, the Rebbeinu Shalom. Pardon?
402 years.
That's what it was?
Yeah.
The Rebbe kept on using the expression 1,000.
402
Okay.
years and 2 months.
You looked it up?
No, it's 400 years from latest Yitzchak. This was a year after latest Yitzchak.
Yeah, it's a good question.
And this was in the second year of the Mikvah.
Right.
And it was at the end of Sivan.
Right. Then the Rebbe added, Shenema vayikra Moshe lo Hishaya bin Nun Yehoshua. Hoshea's name became Yehoshua. Where did this yud stem from? This was a yud which was wandering, a yud that had a shaykhs to a tzedekis, to a tzaddik, to a tzedekis, to Sarai, and later the Rebbeinu Shalom took this name and put it to Yehoshua. The Rebbe raised in this Rashi many questions. First of all, Until now, we've gone through quite a bit of names in Chumash. From the beginning of Bereshis until here, until Lech Lecha, there are quite a bit of names. Rashi did not get involved in explaining what any name means. Even Avram is mentioned constantly. From the beginning of Pashas Lech Lecha, from the end of Noach. Rashi did not get involved to explain that the word Avram means Av of Aram. Rashi didn't do it. Furthermore, there are many names, not all the names which were mentioned until now in the Torah are names of tzaddikim, but there are names of tzaddikim as well mentioned. Mesushelach, other names. Rashi does not get involved in explaining what is the meaning of their name. Very few cases Rashi does get involved. By Noach, maybe there's another exception. And I think it's Cain or... Very few names. So we must say that there's some sort of a reason why Rashi does not explain the names until now. It is Dafke here that Rashi gets involved in explaining Avram Avinu's name. What is the difference between the name of Avram and Avraham? Furthermore, the Raya that Rashi brings from Sarai, there the Yud was taken away from Sarai. By Avraham, the Reish was not taken away. Moneshach. By Avraham, the Reish remained. His name did not change to got a Hey added and the Reish taken out. It has the Reish and the Hey. However, by Sarai, the name was changed where the Yud was taken away and a Hey was given instead. So the whole meaning of Rashi needs interpretation. The Rebbe Zilzunzan is explaining it. Sai by Avraham, as well as Sarah, what happened really was HaKadosh Baruch Hu elevated them. Avram was only an Av of Aram, and the Rebbe put him into a position of Av Hamoin Goyim, which was an elevation for Avram. Sarai as well, the same thing happened. By Sarai, Rashi tells us until now she was only Sarai. She was only had a shaykhs to Avram Avinu. However, now the HaKadosh Baruch Hu changed her name from Sarai to Sarah. She became a Sarah. She became a leader over everyone. So the same idea is reflected by Avram as well as by Sarah. What Rashi means with Reish Hoysa by Metchila Loizazam Im Kaima, Rebbe's teaching, is because the Hey really has a Reish within it as well. With the way we write a letter Hey has a Reish. A Hey just has an additional and a little bit shaped different on top. However, really the letter Reish is contained in the letter Hey. So that's the pshat why Rashi is using an expression Reisha hoisa by mitchila loizaza mim kaima. The Reish did not move from its place. In other words, the Reish could have still been there and been there in a way of zaza mim kaima, moved from its place. Could have been there as part of the Hey. So Rashi is telling us the Reish was left over. Rashi's inyan is not to get involved and explain names. That's why Rashi did not do it until now. And unless wherever there's some sort of an exception. However, here Rashi has to do it, being that the pasuk is giving the reason that why is v'hoya shimcha Avraham ki av hamoin goyim nisaticha ki as the reason that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is making Avraham Avinu as a av hamoin goyim. So Rashi must explain that until now he was not an av hamoin goyim. Until now he was only an av of Aram. However, now koich shel Avraham Avinu. The Rebbe gave him more koiches, and the Rebbe gave him more power, and Avraham Avinu became an Av Hamoin Goyim. The same Benegeya Sarai, it's also different. In other words, Rashi is explaining what really happened here to Sarai. And to Avraham, the same inyan, that they became much bigger than they were before. Sarah was, until then, only Sarai. She was a Sar, she was a leader, only upon Avraham. However, what happened was now she became Sarah l'chol. So that's why Rashi's taka bringing in what happened to Sarah and what happened to Avraham, because it's all important to explain what has transpired here. I've also said that there's a Geschmack Inyan which is brought in Svarim, which is however contradictory to Rashi, and Rashi cannot get involved in explaining this Inyan. There are Mefarshim that explain that what the Rebishter did was, he took away a Yud from Sarai and gave her a Hey instead. The numerical value of a Yud is 10. So all the Rebishter really did was, he took 10 and split it between Avram and Sarah. He gave Avram Hey and he gave Sarah Hey. So really the Yud has nothing to complain about. Because the Rebbe says, on one hand, to say that the Yud was waiting for hundreds of years until she later became part of Yeshua. The Rebbe says, every person has his inyanim. The Yud had a shaykhas to Sarah. Sarai, she had her way of Avodas Hashem. Later Yeshua had different birurim in Avodas Hashem. So obviously, Yeshua and Sarai are really different as far as their Avodas Hashem goes. So to say that the Yud got satisfied when she was later replaced, added on to Hosea, from Hosea became Yeshua, it's not such a pshat which we can say all the way. However, on the other hand, to say in Pshuta Shel Mikra that there's a child to get involved, a 5-year-old child who's just beginning to learn Chumash, and get him involved in a numeric value of a Yud, that the Yud is being split between two people, a Hey on Avram and a Hey on Sarai, this is again something which in Pshuta Shel Mikra it's very hard to learn that way. So that is why Rashi rather chooses to stay away from this drash and gets involved in a pshat that the Yud from Sarai was later added on to Yeshua. However, what happened to Avram was completely changed. He became an Av HaMoingoy. Chassidus, the Rebbe says, we find, Chassidus explains, the Rebbe discussed it in the Maimah today as well as the Sikha here. In Chassidus we find the Inyan of Avram, meaning stressing the greatness of Avram Avinu's Madrege, that he was the Av of a Seichel Hanela Mekol Rayan, a very high Madrege of Chochmah. Ram meaning high, a very high level in Chochmah. So in other words, in Pshuta Shel Mikra, Taka happened in the Inyan of V'lo Yikara the Shimcha Avram, he can no longer be called Avram, and his name was referred to Avraham. Avraham stresses his greatness of Av HaMoin Goyim Nisaticha. However, as the Inyan stands, in Pnimius HaTorah, the Inyan stands that even while his name was Avram, he was also already at a high Madrege, because this is how Chassidus stresses the greatness of the Inyan of Avram, meaning Avram, Av HaSeichel, the Av, the father, the one who possesses, what's the pshat, the father, the one who possesses, the Seichel Hanela Mikol Rayan, this high level of Seichel which no one can have access to. So this is an Inyan which Avram Avinu even possessed while his name was Avram. So in other words, Al Pi Pnimis HaInyanim, he possessed this greatness even before as well. It is only later that it came down Begolui, where we find this the pshat of the pasuk that it came down so Begolui into Pshuta Shel Mikra, obvious and open, that he was changed from an Avram being only a leader in Aram and becoming a leader of Av HaMoin Goy. While talking about Avram and Sarah, so the Rebbe referred to the inyanim which are discussed of Avram and Sarah in this week's Sedra, in the Sedra which we began reading today by Mincha. Today by Mincha we already began to read Parshas Vayera. So Parshas Vayera discusses about Avram and Sarah. Sarah denied laughing when she was promised that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was going to bench them with a child. V'titzchak Sarah b'kirba. Initially she laughed, and she did laugh actually, and then v'techachesh, and she denied it. So while talking about its inyan, we refer to it that this is a Sedra which we're going to begin reading today by Mincha. The Mincha of Shabbos, that is actually that when we already begin having a shaykhs to the new Sedra. Rebbe quoted Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch, where he discusses the inyan of being Mavid Sedra every week. There the Alter Rebbe brings an opinion that until when can we be Madir a Sedra? Until we begin reading the new Sedra. That is, in other words, until Mincha, because by Mincha we already begin reading the new Sedra. The new Sedra, as we begin reading by Mincha, so we say before we Sefer Torah is taken out of the Aron Kodesh, we express ourselves. Vanis filosi lecha Hashem eis ratzain, v'lekim berav chasdecha anini be'emes yishecha. That's what we say Mincha every Shabbos. In other words, we stress that the time of Mincha of Shabbos is a special time. how great the Shabbos is, still when it comes to Mincha, Mincha is an Eis Rotzain. It is a special, suitable time by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In the Emes, Rabbi Zilgazin goes on, we find that the whole week, Mincha is a very suitable time. Because Chazal tell us, La'olam yehi adam zayah b'tfilas ha-mincha, a person should be very careful with Mincha. Sharei Eliyahu lo'inena ela b'tfilas ha-mincha. When did Eliyahu get his response from the Rebishter? When he wanted to prove Yidden, that Yidden should stick only to the Rabbeinu Shalom, this was when the Yidden when they davened Mincha in the time of Mincha. So on one hand we see that the time of Mincha is Mincha time is a very opportune time, as well as Shabbos, and as well as the whole week. The Rebbe got involved. When did the incident with Eliyahu Novi, when did that happen? Was that on a Shabbos, or was that on a weekday? The Rebbe explained that we must say, it's very obvious that the inyan of Eliyahu, when Eliyahu wanted to prove the Yidden, that the Yidden should not have any shaykhs to the Nevi HaBaal, this was something which definitely took place on a midweekday. And Eliyahu would not go ahead and postpone it on a Shabbos. Why? Obviously, there was certain malachas involved in it. Those days they weren't set up with water as we are today, so Eliyahu had to manage to get the water there. And there was an inyan of lighting fire with karbanis. For karbanis that are brought in the Beis HaMikdash, there are special guidelines, special exceptions of karbanis which can be brought in the Beis HaMikdash on Shabbos. However, for Eliyahu to go ahead and take upon himself and bring karbanis and go through this entire procedure on a Shabbos day, we don't have any source where we can rely on to say that he did it on a Shabbos. Especially furthermore, when Eliyahu Novi realized that it's an opportune time to go ahead and get Yidden away from the Baal, and see to it that Yidden only have a shaykhs to the Rabbeinu Shalom, Eliyahu will not postpone it for a Shabbos. This is something which is not postponed. If we have an opportunity to go ahead and prove a mistake to Yidden until that time, we're poischim al shtei hasifim, as the expression is. In other words, they were dancing in both ways. They had a shaykhs to the Nevi HaBaal as well as having a shaykhs to the Rabbeinu Shalom. And this is something which Eliyahu looked to stop. So the minute he had a chance to go ahead and perform something which he felt would convince Yidden, and the Rabbeinu Shalom proved it that way, that the Yidden should only have a shaykhs to the Rabbeinu Shalom and not to the Nevi HaBaal, he did that right away. Being, however, that as we are told in Zoya, that Shabbos, my name is Baruch in Kol Yomin, Shabbos gives bracha to the entire week. Based on this, we must say, the Rebbe goes ahead, that this opportune time, which we have Shabbos Mincha, as we refer to it in davening as an Eis Rotzain, this gives bracha to the Mincha time of the rest of the week, that the Zman Mincha throughout the week shall be an Eis Rotzain. So Shabbos is a very special Eis Rotzain, as we say it in davening before we got to Sefer Torah by Mincha. Vanis Filosi Lecha Hashem Eis Rotzain. And throughout the entire week as well, it is also a tremendous Eis Rotz in the time of Tfilas HaMincha. And that is why Chazal tell us, La'olam yehi adam zayah b'Tfilas HaMincha. A person shall always be careful that with Tfilas HaMincha, because it is a very opportune time that the Rabbeinu Shalom should fulfill our wish. The Negeya, the Zohar in this week's Sedre, the Rebbe referred to the last piece of Zohar in the Sedra, which has comments of his father, which is a pasuk where the Zohar quotes a pasuk, Oz yiboka kashachar oirecha. It's a pasuk which talks that our light will burst, lichtigkeit, kashachar, like the morning. V'aruchascha meheros atzmiach, the pasuk goes on, v'izbiya b'tzachtzachis nafshecha. Psukim, I think we recited in the Haftarah of Yom Kippur morning. In the comments of his father, I believe Yitzchak discusses the greatness of revealing Pnimiyus HaTorah, of spreading Mayonis HaChsidus. Based on this piece of Zohar, and another Zohar which we will have in Parshas Vayera. In Parshas Vayera, the Zohar quotes a pasuk from Parshas Noach. Based on the pasuk, Arubos Hashamayim Niftachu. Anybody remembers what comes before that? When the Mabul began. The pasuk goes on, Arubos Hashamayim Niftachu. Before that, there's an expression. Bishna sheish mei shana l'chayin Noach, as Noach was 600 years old, b'chodesh hasheni b'shiva asa yom l'chodesh hazeh b'yom hazeh nifku kol mayonos toim rabba. That is when the storm of the Mabul really began. V'arubes hashamayim niftachu, the heavens opened and began pouring. V'hi hageshem al ha'aretz. Psukim go on 40 yom ו40 laila. The Zohar ties this pasuk in to completely different inyan. And this Zohar, the Rebbe says, is a Zohar in Parshas Vayera, next in this forthcoming week, Sedra. We know that there are 6,000 Shit al Fishni Hava Alma. There are 6,000 years of the existence of the world. Then comes higher inyan, a higher madrege. In other words, we look at the world in a format, in a cycle of a 6,000 years. Now we are at 5,744. In other words, the Zohar says that it would come. The Zohar gets involved in explaining at length after, when it'll be the latter part of the 5,000. In other words, coming the last 500 years, close to the 6,000, particularly more the last 400 years. After Sheish Meya Shana, touches it on Sheish Meya Shana after 600 years, into the 5,000. In other words, after it is 5,600 years, then it will come a time where Zohar says it explains that everyone will have a shaykhus to Pnimiyus HaTorah. To the Pnimiyus of Torah, which is actually, as we interpret it, it is Chasidus. The Zohar uses an expression, even Ravya, which in Aramaic means even youngsters, even children, will also have a shaykhus to Pnimiyus HaTorah. And this is something like a Toyamel Chaim Zochu. Just like we know that Friday afternoon we are supposed to taste Macholei Shabbos, the same thing, this is like this Friday afternoon. In the spiritual sense, we're already right before the coming of the Mashiach. Rabbi throughout the Farbrengen today stressed many times that all the simonim which we find in Chazal, which describe what the world is going to look like when Mashiach will come, we already have. And as we constantly keep on praying for the coming of Mashiach now, so it's already really time for Mashiach to come. I mentioned it a few times throughout this afternoon's Farbrengen. So Mamela, that Zohar as well also discusses how now is the time for the spreading of Chasidus, to see to it that Chasidus reaches out to each and every Yid, and every Yid has a shaykhus to Chasidus. The Pnimiyus HaTorah, which is Chasidus. In these psukim of Oz Yiboka Kashachar Erecha as well, the pasuk goes on, V'yizbiya b'tzachtzachos nafshecha. The Rebbe says, Al pi Kabbalah, the word tzachtzachos also supposed to represent a very high madrege in Kabbalah. So therefore the Rebbe urged again that we're on a very extreme opportune time, especially now that is not only is it after 600 years in this cycle of 5,000, it is more than 5,600 years of Briyas Olam. We have gone through already, as the expression by Chassidim is, after Peterburg. This is a famous expression, after the Alter Rebbe has been arrested. There's a whole interpretation from the Rebbe Rashab, from the Rebbe Nishmaseiden, the Rebbe Reb Shalom Ber, whereby he explains that the spreading of Chassidus by the Alter Rebbe began with a much stronger force, much more forcefully, after the Alter Rebbe was released from prison. So this is usually referred to in an expression of after Peterburg. In other words, after the Alter Rebbe has been arrested in Peterburg. At that time, today's Leningrad. The Rebbe added on, not only is it after Peterburg, it is already after the release from Pei Zayin, 1927, when the Frierdiker Rebbe was in prison. So Mamela, it's already the real opportune time to see to it, to reach out to Yidden, to see to it that the Eira Chassidus, the light of Chassidus, of Pnimiyus HaTorah, should reach to each and every Yid. And talking about Oz Yiboka Kashachar Erecha, which is a pasuk quoted in this week's Zohar. Chazal bring this pasuk having a shaykhus to Yaakov. What is the shaykhus between the pasuk of Oz Yiboka Kashachar Erecha to Yaakov Avinu? A very obvious shaykhus. The word Yiboka is composed with the same lettering as the word Yaakov. Yaakov is spelled Yud Ayin Kuf Beis. Yiboka has the same letters. Yud Beis Kuf Ayin, just differently. So Chazal Taki say that this pasuk is said as a wish to Yaakov Avinu. In fact, the Rebbe says if we look back to the Inyanim of Chassidus, which have a shaykhus to Sukkos, for those that say Ushpizen on Sukkos, the spiritual guest which we have on Sukkos, So on the day which is Yaakov Avinu's Shpiza, which is the third day of Sukkot, Avram Yitzchak Yaakov, this is the pasuk which is recited. Oz Yiboka Kashachar Erecha. Why? What's the shaycha? It's a very obvious one. Because the pasuk of Oz Yiboka really refers to Yaakov. Yiboka Oisi is Yaakov. The same lettering as Yaakov. And this is the pasuk giving tremendous bracha. Oz Yiboka Kashachar Erecha. In other words, Yaakov will be blessed that his light will be as the morning star, the light of morning. Rebbe tied us in again. Oz Yiboka Kashachar Erecha. We're talking about Yaakov. When are we talking about this union of Yaakov? This is being discussed in Parshas Lech Lecha, and the Chazarah when we just now discussed early in the Farbrengen, the great importance of a Yaakov Holach L'Darkei. So the Yaakov Holach L'Darkei, we are blessed in turn with the bracha of Oz Yiboka Kashachar Erecha. In other words, going into the derech which we are going into for the entire year, taking along with us all the great treasures which we were given throughout the month of Tishrei. Tishrei abbreviating, being composed as the same word as Reishis, which the Rebbe discussed throughout the entire month. In other words, Tishrei is the beginning of the year and gives us strength to be able to fulfill all the inyanim throughout the entire year. So we're taking this inyan of Yaakov Holach L'Darkei in a format of Oz Yiboka Kashachar Erecha, being blessed that our light will burst. In other words, we will burst into a position of lichtigkeit. Kashachar, just like the morning, coming as a result of fulfilling the Yaakov Holach L'Darkei. The Rebbe stressed, HaMaisa Hu Ha'ikar. What is most important is Maisa, is action. And action is to get involved on all levels of Yidden, to reach to those Yidden who in the interim are not knowledgeable of the Aleph Beis of Yiddishkeit, and to reach to them and teach them literally the Aleph Beis of Yiddishkeit, as well as to those Yidden who are well learned and well versed, but they have to be taught the Hemshech HaPosik. As we just mentioned, Oz Yiboka Kashachar Erecha, then the Posik uses the expression V'hizbiya b'tzachtzachos nafshecha, and you will be. V'hizbiya means we will become full. Our souls will become full with very pleasant inyanim. So we just mentioned the Rebbe Taich, tzachtzachos al pi Kabbalah refers to very high madregas in Kabbalah. Who are already familiar with Yiddishkeit. However, they have to become close to this level of tzachtzachos. In other words, they have to become familiar with high and deep inyanim chassidus. To reach out to these Yidden as well and make sure we bring to them the light of Pnimi Satayra, the light of Rozen, the Araisa, the Inyan of Chassidus, which all of this, reaching to all levels of Yidden, in a format of a Maisa Hu Ha'ikar, will bring to the bracha of Oz Yiboka Kashachar Erecha, with the coming of Mashiach now, which we constantly pray for.